when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous, but no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, had always struggled with their identity. They longed to be accepted as Americans. They felt like Americans, and by law, they were Americans. But their culture was so different. Their clothes, their food, their faces. In a time of deep-seated racism in America, assimilation was nearly impossible. And during World War II, the Japanese Americans, who loved America so much, were downright dehumanized. Internment camps, enabled by Executive Order 9066, opened across the country and held these 120,000 loyal Japanese American men, women, and children. This complex political, social, and racial conflict was solved through 3 Supreme Court cases. These 3 people fought for their freedom and eventually led to that of all Japanese Americans. Prior to World War II, life for Japanese Americans was, although to a lesser degree, still rather difficult. Widespread systemic racism prevented even the most educated Nisei, second-generation Japanese citizens, from working jobs outside ethnic communities.
Across the street, there was a big golf course, which we were not allowed on because it's for whites only. And one of our neighbors had a son who wanted to work, so they hired him as a groundskeeper, and the members protested, so he had to quit. They didn't want any Japanese Americans on, even as a groundkeeper.
While there were evident racial tensions, anti-Japanese pressures began sweeping the nation towards the beginning of World War II. These pressures peaked at Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1942. A surprise attack by Japanese fighter planes killed more than 2,000 and 1,000 more are wounded. While the attack left many Americans in shock, the Japanese Americans would face much harsher repercussions.
And then also, my mother's cousin was a Japanese rep for a silk company in Japan, in New York. And he left about 6 months before the war broke out, and he said, there's going to be a war. They're calling him back to Japan. So I guess it was brewing, and we as youngsters just didn't think anything about it until it happened.
As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense. On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Torn between 2 countries, they realized that they would now appear as enemies to white Americans. The groundwork for the camps had already been laid. The military was just awaiting the permission of the U.S. government. President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 was the green light the military had been waiting for. It added to Proclamation 2537. Not only were Japanese Americans to be arrested whenever deemed appropriate, but they would now be sent to a designated military base, later known as an internment camp.
They built makeshift barracks in the remotest areas of the United States, including Manzanar. I've been to Manzanar twice. It's right next to Death Valley. You've heard of Death Valley. The highest temperature ever recorded in the U.S. was in Death Valley, completely dry. And the only living creatures that can survive in that climate are reptiles. And they were told that the United States government was going to protect them against hostile forces in the United States because there was a very strong anti-Japanese sentiment after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But when they got to the camp, they noticed that the guns were pointing at them, not away from them.
It was all Army barracks, and I don't know whether you know Army barracks at all. They're tar-papered like houses, row after row after row after row, and it was dust in the Dust Bowl. And we had to stuff newspaper in the windows, otherwise it would get all over your clothes and everything. And the partitions were open, so if people started fighting or something, you could hear it all through the barrack. There's 4 or 5 families in one barrack. And then we went to mess hall to eat, and we had to stand in line in that heat, and I'd pass out.
Within the camps, the Japanese Americans were assigned to complete a loyalty questionnaire that consisted of just 2 questions. Many Japanese Americans declared their loyalty despite what the government had done to them. Others, labeled the no-no group after their answers on the questionnaire, recognized the wrongdoing and were often scorned by other internees. Outside the camp was a deep racial conflict. Anti-Japanese propaganda flooded the media, further dehumanizing the Japanese Americans. The Japanese American Credit League, or JACL, protested the government's acts against both Nisei and Isai, but many of their efforts were unsuccessful due to lack of support.
Some fought by making cases to the Supreme Court. On May 4, 1942, Gordon Hirabayashi, a student at the University of Washington, began to disobey curfew and exclusion orders for alien enemies and Americans of Japanese descent. He was arrested for such, and he was found guilty at his hearing on October 20, 1942. He then took his case to the Supreme Court. In May of 1943, the Supreme Court did such, but just over a month later, the court's unanimous opinion upheld Hirabayashi's curfew conviction. Nonetheless, his efforts were successful. His case inspired Japanese Americans to fight. It was the first challenge to the government's wartime curfew and expulsion of Japanese Americans, and surely not the last.
The second and more famous case involves a man named Fred Korematsu. Fred Korematsu was 23 years old when he refused to leave his California home despite Executive Order 9066. To avoid arrest, he got surgery to change his physical appearance and changed his name to Clyde Serra in an attempt to pass as a man of Spanish and Hawaiian descent. However, later that year, Korematsu was arrested off the street. He was charged with violating military orders by refusing to comply with Executive Order 9066, and thereafter was interned in Utah. Still, he questioned the legality of his imprisonment, so he appealed his case to the U.S. Supreme Court. He emphasized the fact that neither German Americans nor Italian Americans were interned, only the Japanese. Nonetheless, in 1944, in a 6-3 decision, the case was deemed constitutional and was thereby dropped. The case was, and still is, extremely significant. It showed that the U.S. government could forcibly move people solely based on their race. This was outrageous to the Japanese Americans and Americans in general.
The third case involved 21-year-old Mitsui Endo on October 12, 1944. Endo, a lawful American citizen, had been taken from her home in Sacramento and interned at Tule Lake. She, like the majority of internees, had not committed a crime, nor was she legally charged for such. But because of her Japanese descent, she was interned. However, unlike the other 2 cases, Endo's case didn't highlight this ethnic discrimination. The Civil Rights Act had not been established until 1964, meaning that the Supreme Court hadn't exactly dealt with large-scale cases involving race yet. Endo instead decided to center her case on the writ of habeas corpus, meaning that Endo had been imprisoned without cause, and law enforcement was to be demanded to release her. This focus made her case successful.
On December 17, 1944, the day before Endo's case was decided in her favor, President Roosevelt announced the closing of the internment camps. The Japanese Americans left internment camps feeling guilty and ashamed, as they had been aggressively accused of betraying their country.
And some of the internees said they wanted to stay in the camp if that's what it took for them to show that their loyalty was to the United States, not to Japan.
Many Isai had lost their home and the majority of their belongings and were unable to financially recover from such a loss. Racial tensions were still fierce, meaning that many of the released were unable to secure a job as well. In 1976, President Gerald R. Ford issued Proclamation 4417, the American Promise, an official apology to the internees. 11 years later, President Reagan offered $20,000 in compensation to the wronged Japanese Americans in the 1987 Civil Liberties Act. Many felt that the compensation was hush money. It was, in a way, money in return for silence. Others felt that their pain and suffering should not be put to a number, for no amount of money could ease the emotional distress they had to experience.